Friends, terrible news from the front. Our way of life is under siege from the car-hating bureaucrats in this building and this building. They want to take away our divine right as car guys and car gals to own at least one V12 in our lifetimes. And so far, their efforts have been successful to the point where the number of new V12 offerings in the world is dwindling. So today, you and I need to rise up and go on a journey to determine what our car guy brothers and sisters are doing in the engineering world to bring the fight back to these bicycle-riding communists. Okay, so let's try this again, but we need to be rather scientific because it's incredibly rare that you and I have virtually the same car, just a different engine with some various tweaks around the car. So, a couple of things we're going to keep constant. Number one, this is the exact same road that we took the 12-cylinder DB11. And if you didn't notice, the exact same driver. Oh, but even with all the stuff we control in our little scientific experiment, there's one thing we don't control, and that is 320 less pounds, which we talked about in the tech review. And 97 less horsepower, but the torque, negligible difference. So let's put our foot into it. Going around a nice turn here. We got an elevation change going uphill. See how it comes out of this beautiful turn. And this is in basic mode. And, okay, but pageantry aside, let's try this thing going up a steeper hill now in the Sport Plus mode. And this thing, what's the technical term? She ain't no slouch. Man, Becker and the guys over at Gated, they took a Mercedes hard, took the coldness out of it. Now let's take a break from driving and discuss the business case as to why this derivation of DB11 exists. That would be tax schemes around the world. And let's start with the 800-pound gorilla in the space, China. So the V12 sister to this car is subject to three separate taxes in China. The first one is an import tax of 25% on any car that is not manufactured in China and does not have a Chinese manufacturing partner. Now, as an aside here, it boggles my mind that the international community lets China get away with this complete ploy to steal intellectual property, but that is a story for another day. Then, on top of that, there is a displacement tax on the V12. The 8-cylinder, not so much, because of the 4 liters. Then, just announced last year, there's a consumption tax on top of all these taxes, which is an additional 10% on anything above $190,000 US. Now let's move down under, and they too have a sort of consumption tax. They call it a luxury tax, but the threshold is much lower. It's 65,000 Australian dollars, and it's 33% on top of the car's price. Then there's an import tax of 5%, any car not manufactured in Australia. Really humorous when you think that they no longer manufacture cars in Australia. Then on top of that, there's a 10% GST. Now, it would stand to reason that the UK Inland Revenue would be more hospitable to the DB11. Turns out that's not the case. Like all cars in the UK, it's subject to a 17.5% VAT on the purchase price and a £140 per year road tax. On top of that, there's a luxury tax of sorts, a £310 per year payable for the first 5 years on anything over £40,000 in purchase price. Then on top of that, there's a CO2 tax, basically an emissions tax. And the V12 DB11 is in the second highest CO2 bracket. That means £1,700. An AMG GT, as a basis of comparison, is in the third highest CO2 bracket. That's £1,200. So translated, this is not including the VAT. Okay, now I've stepped down to the basic in the damper setting. Let's try this thing with all these little changes they've made. All the hardware we talked about is the same from the 12-cylinder, and hang on. Yeah, she still works. Okay, we are now in Sport Plus. And the thing you do notice is lighter weight over the front wheels, which I fully expected. But what's interesting is it's now, instead of 5149, it's 4951. So you do feel it sitting on its hind quarters. Although what's interesting is there's no like squat on the outside, not even any lean. I mean, it's still beautifully balanced like the DB11 with the 12 cylinder. So let's go around this beautiful turn here downhill. Please don't try this at home and disturb the plane of motion of a rather large car that sounds glorious. And what's fascinating is, I would argue this is, from a driving dynamics perspective, it's far more lively, especially when you're doing things like this that you shouldn't be doing in such a large vehicle. Remember, this is a 110-inch wheelbase. We shouldn't be able to do that. As a basis of comparison, a 911, which should do that, is over, 14 inches shorter wheelbase than this. If you are a longtime viewer of this show, I'm willing to bet money that you fancy yourself one hell of a car spotter. So if that's the case, riddle me this. How can you tell the difference between a DB11 with a V12 and one with a V8 without opening up the hood? I'll give you a minute to sort that out. The aluminum strakes are lovely, aren't they? But that's not the difference. Bist du fertig? Ich auch. Well, the lights front and back are different. The vents in the hood are different. The finish on the wheels is also different. The one thing that isn't different, there is not one badge on the exterior of this entire car that says V8. Okay, so let's cover a couple of notes here now that I've spent some time, really a lot of time, between these two cars, and this is more usability stuff. Let's start with the seats. They're not bad, but I would argue that the performance of the car, this and the 12-cylinder, would deserve some more supportive seats. And I gotta believe Aston Martin, where they kind of do anything you want, there has to be more supportive, like especially down here, seats that are on offer. At least you could probably get them to do it if you had big enough of a blank check. And my guess, that's probably going to come in the Vantage. And then again, along the same lines, the difference between a V8 and a V12, at least from a content perspective, is negligible. In fact, there's no difference, like navigation, trip computer, the way the thing is set up on the inside, the stuff that you would think other manufacturers say, oh, you don't get because you don't give us enough money. And then last but not least, an open letter to Mr. Becker and Dr. Palmer over there. I've asked you this many times. Please, how about a sunroof? Maybe a glass roof, something. Because I like the undisturbed line of the coupe. Not always want to go for the convertible, but still would like an open car. If you could sort that out for me, I'd be greatly appreciative. So I'm about to say something that I never thought I would say in the same sentence. This Aston Martin does not have abysmal fuel economy. Let me say that again. This Aston Martin does not have abysmal fuel economy. In the time that I have been driving it, I'm actually doing respectable fuel economy, which gets me to a place where, again, I didn't know I'd ever be here. And if I'm honest, I like this better. This is a more lively flavor of the DB11, and I didn't expect to like this better. And here's why, because the V12 exists. And I am a huge believer that every car guy and car gal, at least once in their lifetime, needs a V12. They gotta own one. It's a rite of passage. And that opportunity, there are fewer and fewer on offer in the market. And here is one that is still on offer. So I'd have a hard time saying no to a V12 in this, simply because V12 stirs the car guy and gal soul. But if I'm really honest, if you want the better car, the V8 is the one to have. So there I said it. 2 sentences I never thought I'd say. Until I see you next time, bis später.